My name is Dr. Kelly Kassan, and I'm going to talk to you today about biology and other sciences. And I'm going to give you some basic concepts of biology that we will be learning in greater detail in the coming weeks, and also the scientific method, which is used in biology and other sciences. So the concepts that we're going to discuss today are the properties of life, what makes something alive, the levels of organization of living things, atoms to biosphere, the classification of living things. How do we know that something is a plant versus a bacteria versus an animal? And finally, biology as a scientific discipline. I'm going to describe the scientific method and the correct way to use it. So the first thing I'd like you to think about is, what is alive? I have a picture of a hooded rat, and the hooded rat is holding a little teddy bear. So take a moment to think, maybe write down, what makes the rat alive, but the teddy bear not alive? So take a moment to write a few things down. We're going to discuss this later. Okay, biologists have several criteria of life. To be considered a living organism, you must meet all of these criteria. The first criteria is ordered complexity. In other words, all living organisms have a form and function that works to keep them alive. Another criteria is sensitivity, or response to stimuli. All living organisms will respond to stimuli like light, pain, water, the smell of food, and so forth. Reproduction. All living organisms have a means of reproducing themselves either through asexual, which means without sex, or sexual reproduction. Growth and development. Once you have babies, those babies will grow and develop until they become mature themselves. All living organisms, even bacteria, start out smaller, and they need to grow and develop before they can reproduce again. Another criteria is being able to regulate your internal function. This is called homeostasis. Know that term, it will be on the exam. So homeostasis, the ability to maintain a constant internal condition, internal within the body. Examples include body temperature, blood sugar levels, pH levels, the amount of salt in your body, so on and so forth. Energy processing. Energy processing, all organisms either eat food and then process it to form energy through glycolysis and cellular respiration, or they can make their food. We see this in plants and protists and even cyanobacteria, which is what we call blue-green algae, but they're actually bacteria. They are all capable of doing some form of photosynthesis using light to form glucose and then break that glucose down to form energy. A couple of other criteria of life that is not mentioned in the textbooks but is still true, and I will accept this on the exam, is that all living organisms have at least one true cell. And all living organisms have a DNA genome, not an RNA. So going through these criteria, Ordered complexity. Even if you're a single cell, like the little yellow bacteria there, you still have a form and a function that keeps you alive. Sensitivity and response to stimuli. The picture on the left is a plant that when you touch it, it folds its leaves inward. It responds to the stimuli of you touching it. Sunflowers on the right, they actually move that big seed head to track the sun across the sky. And we have a couple of young raccoons here that are fighting. Another response to stimuli. If somebody pokes you, you're going to poke back. Reproduction. All things reproduce, either asexually, like we see with the bacteria and the paramecium here, or through sexually, where you have a male and a female parent that the gametes join to form new embryos that grow to adults. So spiders, the turtles, and the fish, they all reproduce sexually. But all living organisms are able to reproduce either asexually or sexually. Growth and development. Once you have the babies, whether they are juvenile bacteria or baby turtles or baby cheetahs like I have here in the lower right, or birds that lay eggs, those young must grow before they can reproduce again, and that's part of growth and development. Regulation, otherwise known as homeostasis, do you know that term? The ability to maintain a constant internal condition. Birds and mammals are able to maintain a constant body temperature. All vertebrates are able to control the blood sugar level, so on and so forth. This is all homeostasis. Energy processing. Either a living organism eats food that is processed into energy via glycolysis or cellular respiration, and plants, some protists, and cyanobacteria are able to process sunlight, which is another form of energy, to make glucose, which they can then break down into ATP, another form of energy. All of this is energy processing. A true cell. A true cell has a phospholipid bilayer, and so they have two layers of phospholipids, which are lipids with phosphates attached to them. Inside that phospholipid bilayer, which is the cell membrane, they have cytoplasm, a jelly-like substance that kind of gives the cell its shape. It also contains the genome, which I mentioned in all living organisms. This is DNA. And all living organisms have ribosomes, which produce the proteins that provide the structure. There are two types of true cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Prokaryotic does not have a nucleus. Eukaryotic does have a nucleus. All living organisms have a DNA genome. However, viruses sometimes have a DNA genome. Sometimes they have RNA as their genome. But by strict definition, viruses are not considered alive. For one thing, they are either DNA or RNA covered with protein. That's the simpler viruses. Some will have a lipid coat over the capsid, the protein coat. But none of them have a lipid bilayer which contains cytoplasm and ribosomes. No virus has that. So they lack a true cell. Because they lack a true cell and they lack ribosomes and other structures, they are unable to conduct homeostasis. So they can't regulate their internal condition. They also cannot reproduce by themselves. In order to reproduce, they have to hijack a host cell and use that host cell's enzymes and nucleotides and ribosomes and so forth to produce new viruses. They cannot do that by themselves because they don't have any of that stuff. They have to steal it from a host cell. Viruses cannot grow or develop. When the host cell is used to make new viruses, those viruses look exactly and are the same size as the original virus. So they do not grow or develop. All right, let's talk about the levels of biological organization. The smallest unit of matter is atoms. Atoms still retain the characteristics of that matter. If it's a carbon atom, it has the characteristics of being carbon. If it's a sodium atom, it has the characteristics of being sodium. So atoms is the smallest unit of matter. Molecules is when you have two or more atoms bound together. For example, a glucose molecule, and you're going to see glucose a little later. Glucose molecule has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygen atoms all bound together. If you have, the next level is cells, and a cell is the smallest unit of a living organism. You must have at least one true cell to be considered alive. If you have a bunch of cells together that all perform the same function, you have tissues like nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue. Several tissues bound together will form organs. For example, your stomach. Your stomach has an outer layer of epithelial tissue. Underneath it has smooth muscle tissue. And so that is forming the organ, the stomach. All organs is several tissues working to form that organ. The next level is the organism. That is the individual of a species. That is an organism. A population is a group of organisms of the same species. So you can have a population of cheetahs or a population of crows. They must be the same species. A community is when you have several species living in the same habitat. So here in the San Luis Valley, we have a desert habitat, and we have mule deer and ravens and bacteria and juniper and other species that live in this desert community. An ecosystem is even bigger. You take a habitat, you make it bigger. You have forest ecosystems, you have marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems. That is what an ecosystem. And all the ecosystems on Earth forms the biosphere. And that just shows you from atoms to the biosphere. All right, how do we classify living things? Taxonomy is the science of grouping species based on common ancestry. So we look at an unknown organism, and based on the characteristics of that organism, we determine whether it is a plant, an animal, a fungi, a bacteria, an archaea, and so forth. And then we can, once we determine that, then we can go narrower and say, okay, this unknown is an animal and it belongs to mollusks, so it's more similar to mollusks than any other animal, so on and so forth. But that is the science of taxonomy. The 3 domains of life is, the domain is the biggest unit. You don't get any bigger than domain. We have 3 domains. Bacteria, which are unicellular, means they have only one cell, and they are prokaryotic. They do not have a nucleus. Archaea is also unicellular, and it's also a prokaryote. They look very similar to bacteria, but biochemically, their cell wall is very different, which is why they are placed in their own domain. Everything else is eukaryotic. They have a cell with a nucleus. They may be unicellular, like the paramecium and euglena, or they may be multicellular, like the plants, the fungi, and the animals. But if their cells contain a nucleus, they belong to the domain eukarya. So let's take a look at the different domains. So the bacteria, they can have different shapes. We got rod shapes, we got spheres, we got little curved ones. We have spirochetes, which are very spiral in shape. And they can form chains, they can form clusters, so on and so forth. But they are all single-celled and they are all prokaryotic. The domain archaea, very similar to bacteria, but their cell wall is made up of different chemicals than the cell wall of a bacteria. Also, many archaea are extremophiles. They like to live in extreme environments that would kill most other living organisms, like the hot springs at Yellowstone, the Dead Sea, which is so salty that nothing can live in it except archaea and other salt-tolerant organisms, acid and alkaline environments, so on and so forth. And then finally, the domain eukarya, the largest one. The cells have a nucleus. They can be single-celled, like we see on the far left. We've got a paramecium, a dinoflagellate, and a euglena. Those are all single-celled protists, and they are eukarya because their cell has a nucleus. It can be plants, it can be fungi, or it can be animals. No matter how simplistic the animal is, it is a eukarya because the cells have a nucleus. All right, now that we've gone through the real basic taxonomy of all living organisms, now I'd like to talk about the scientific method. And we're going to start with what is the difference between science and pseudoscience. The difference is real science uses the scientific method. We're going to discuss that later. There are testable hypotheses, and they go through a series of steps to determine whether that hypothesis is valid or not valid. Not valid meaning falsified. Real science progresses as we get better technology, better equipment, more information, new experimental ideas. This may lead to previous conclusions being falsified. This happens all the time in science. So science does progress. It doesn't, just because you've just because you have run a test that shows that your hypothesis is valid, doesn't mean it's going to stay valid, because better equipment, better technology, a better way of running the experiment may end up falsifying that hypothesis in the future. Real science does not offer proof. You cannot prove a hypothesis. You can only falsify a hypothesis. And the reason for that is because there may be alternative hypotheses. If you haven't tested them all, then you cannot say that you have proved your single hypothesis. So hypotheses can never be proven. They can only be disproven or falsified.